Hello, everybody, and thanks for tuning in. My name is Samantha De La Pena with Berkeley Air Monitoring Group, and this is Module 2 of the ADALY online tutorials. Today, I'll be talking to you about monitoring parameters, monitoring procedures and guidelines, and monitoring requirements and schedule. So for this module, we'll be talking about monitoring parameters, monitoring procedures and guidelines, and within that subject, household surveys and technology usage monitoring, and lastly, monitoring requirements and schedule. So just to recap what we learned in Module 1, we presented the methodology overview, including the overview of eligible technology and practices, approach to estimate the ADALYs, key requirements, and summary of monitoring requirements for ADALYs. We also discussed the methodology, which requires monitoring of PM 2.5 exposure levels before and after intervention, along with cooking pattern, and then using the established disease exposure response curves at the country level to estimate averted ADALYs. Prior to monitoring the PM 2.5 exposure level, it requires the identification of representative baseline and project scenarios and carrying out different studies for each individual scenario, as you can see summarized in the table on this slide. The project developer should typically group the target population into representative baseline scenarios based on fuel and technology use patterns and cooking setup within the study area. The project developer may also identify multiple baseline scenarios that are applicable in relation to the different project technologies, and this is dependent on local fuel and technology use patterns. Just an example, one baseline scenario may represent rural end users, predominantly using inefficient wood stoves, while another or second baseline scenario may represent a target population in peri-urban areas, predominantly using inefficient charcoal stoves. In this module, we're going to present requirements and guidelines on household survey and technology usage monitoring. So let's talk about household surveys. So the first survey that's performed is the baseline household survey or the participant survey. And these surveys are really important as they give us information of what's happening before the intervention, and then we can compare that information to what has happened after the intervention. So the reason we do these baseline surveys is to collect information on baseline cooking practices and information about our target population. That information includes baseline fuel consumption, baseline technology use, seasonal variations in baseline technology and fuel use. And the seasonal variation information is very important because oftentimes the before and after study, the measurements can take place in different seasons, and it's really important we ask questions and make observations about those seasonal variations so we can account for any changes in our analysis. The surveys are administered prior to the distribution of the project technology, and then they are repeated again at crediting period renewal. How? So there are many ways to administer these surveys. You can do them manually, or you can use a software to collect them, and we can talk more about that, or you can read more about that in objectives of surveys and sample questions in the household survey guidelines, which is an annex 2 of our ADALYs methodology. Some things to remember for the baseline household survey are getting consent from participating households, guaranteeing data privacy, which is low risk from the equipment, non-responsibility for loss or damage to the equipment, and the ability to withdraw from the study at any time without penalty. It's really important that participants know all of these factors before they agree to participate, and these factors also may help them to be more willing to participate. Personal identifiers such as name, household number, or any type of address associated with the home should not be entered into the primary database. It should be entered into a separate database. Households should be identified in the database only by ID numbers, with a code linking those ID numbers to the personal identifiers, which are kept in the separate database. After the study is complete, these personal identifiers should be deleted. Um, no photos should be taken in which individuals can be identified without prior consent. If your IRB allows and the participant consents, then photos of faces can be taken, but only if those two requirements are met. This slide shows the stepwise approach for a baseline household survey, and I'll let you take the time to read over these steps on your own. I just want to mention that the pilot distribution record is the plan of how many stoves you actually plan to install. So the next survey that's administered after the baseline survey is the project survey. And the reason the project survey is administered is to gather information on year-to-year trends and end user characteristics like how they're using the technology, which type of fuel they're using, if they're transitioning fuels, kitchen characteristics, and again, the seasonal variation that we talked about before. It also identifies changes over time. The project survey should be administered annually after 6 months of start use of the new technology in the households using the project devices. The survey can be administered again by manual or electronic means, and you can read more about this in Annex 2 of the ADALYs methodology. So I'll just talk a little bit about what the surveys that we talked about should contain. So for the baseline survey, we need to know for what purposes are the fuels being burned for household energy needs. This could be for food, for making beverages, for heating, for lighting. We also want to know what fuel types are used for each purpose. It's common that multiple fuel types are used, even if the user only has one primary stove. We want to know what type of stove. We want to know where the cooking is performed. This can matter a great deal when analyzing the data. We'd like to know what the gender and age of the primary cook of the household is, how many people are living in the house that are under 5 years old, and how many people are living in the house excluding children under 5 years, including the primary cook. And this is all really important information which can help make things really clear once we actually get a look at the concentrations of the exposure in the household. In the project survey, we want to know if there are any changes where the technology targeted by the project is being used. We want to know, are there any changes in the types or extent to which fuels are used for household energy needs? And the change is from baseline to now. Are there any changes to the total number of people living in the house and children under 5 years? And is the project stove being used on a daily basis by the household? And if yes, for what purposes? One important thing to avoid when you're designing your baseline and project survey is to avoid a loaded question. And a loaded question is any kind of question which suggests the answer within the question itself. So, for example, if you were to ask, does your room have the same number of rooms as your neighbors? This might encourage the participant to maybe say she has the same rooms as her neighbor if she has less, or more rooms as her neighbor if she wants to be impressive. A better way of answering this question would be to ask, how many rooms does your house have? It's more direct and doesn't encourage any inaccuracy. There's also a social acceptability bias where the user may give an answer that she or he thinks we want to hear. Another really important thing to remember during surveys is to have really careful translation, and oftentimes we use back translations as well. So a few more examples of loaded questions are given on this slide. If you'd like to pause the recording for a moment, you can read over these and decide which of the questions is the correct way to ask about the number of people living in a home. The correct way to ask this question would be number 2, how many people, including yourself, live in this home? It's the most direct and doesn't encourage any inaccuracy. I want to give you a few more tips for designing the questions on your baseline and participant survey. The most important thing I can advise is keeping it clear and simple. Are your words going to be understood? You may want to consider using really basic terminology. For example, wheezing might be too technical a term, and you could use coughing instead, something that's really universal and easy to translate. You also want to ask only questions that are needed for the study aim. The longer the questionnaire, the more likely the participant is going to lose their focus. And also, the less time we could spend in the household is better for that participant and for the survey, likely. Uh, a tip would be to use simple analogies or comparisons. If you're asking about health impacts and burns, you can say, how many burns did you receive that are smaller than a coin from your stove in the last month? You may also use pictures when appropriate. If you need to show examples of stoves, that can be very handy. You also want to do use clear and standard definitions of seemingly straightforward concepts such as households, rooms, employment, and primary stove. The questionnaires also need to be adapted for local conditions. Please consider local language and terminology. It's often the case that we'll have a study area that speaks many different languages, and the questionnaires need to be translated into multiple languages, and the field team needs to have the capacity to speak the language necessary within the whole area. Um, Questions may need to be created or deleted for climatic and geographic conditions. In some regions, heating is needed almost all year round. In some regions, heating is never used in the homes. Please be sensitive to cultural taboos. It might not be a good idea to ask about alcohol brewing if it's illegal and looked down upon in the community. Cultural practices are something important to consider. For example, in Central America, sauna use by burning biomass is very common. I'm just going to briefly discuss a few more considerations and pilot testing. So pilot testing is very important. It can be done in as small as 3 to 4 pilot households and can end up saving a lot of time and money in the long run. Something else to consider is, do the response categories capture all options? Sometimes adjustments need to be made to the surveys um, just based on what you've learned from the pilot study, and the responses can include things that weren't originally considered when designing the study. Um, Another consideration is, are there any cultural sensitivities in relation to specific questions? And we can also find this out through the pilot study. Are there the questions interpreted in the same way by different respondents? And visiting more than one household during the pilot can help us with this. Do the questions measure what they are supposed to measure? And are the questions answered in the same way if repeated with the same respondent? Meaning, is there reproducibility within the questionnaire if using the same enumerator? So That's some general information about designing your questionnaires. As I mentioned before, you can find more information in Annex 2 of the ADALYs methodology, but let's move on now to talk about technology usage monitoring. The objective of technology use monitoring is to be able to exclude the households that are no longer using the technology from the ADALY calculation. And it's really important that we determine the fraction of users who have stopped using the project technology completely. Um, the rate of use of project stoves is a really important parameter for the quantification of emissions and exposure reductions. Uh, we also um, monitor technology use to define and understand stove use, to understand seasonal influences, to ensure unbiased data collection using independent survey teams, and to implement good verification checks. The ADALYs methodology provides the detailed requirements and guidance on usage monitoring. It includes 3 levels of usage rate monitoring requirements of increasing rigor that each have maximum usage rates that can be claimed by applying them. The level A mandatory monitoring requirement must be followed by all projects. The level B, good practice monitoring requirements, and the level C, best practice monitoring requirements are optional. And in order to apply a higher level of usage rate, all of the requirements from the levels beneath should be followed. And I'll give you a second to look at this table. Technology usage monitoring should be done annually or more frequently if possible, and in all cases, on time for any request of issuance. Stove use measurements can be taken via survey, and if the survey method is used, a minimum total sample size is 100, with at least 30 samples for project technologies of each age being credited. Also with surveys, simple random or any other commonly used sampling approach, such as stratified random sampling, is recommended. Another option besides surveys is continuous stove monitors, and the sample size for this is 100 households for at least 90 days, with at least 30 samples for project technologies of each age being credited. Defining stove use can be quite complicated, and understanding the difference between use versus non-use is very complex. So some things we can look at when attempting to do this are the time since last used, the frequency of use, the duration of the use, and the extent to which the traditional technology is displaced. There are other factors to consider as well, but these 4 are probably the most important to look at. Also, the definition of stove use must fit into the broader set of required monitoring methods, parameters, record keeping, and equations to quantify emissions and exposure reductions. So as we just discussed, there are 2 primary methods for measuring stove use, surveys and sensors, and there are definitely pros and cons to each. Surveys uh, are used very often because most studies already are collecting some kind of information via a survey, which makes them really accessible. They're also versatile, adaptable, and achievable. They can be standalone or alongside other technologies, such as sensors. Uh, there are multiple types of questions, which we talked about a little bit earlier. They can be administered in multiple ways, which we also talked about earlier. One thing we didn't mention was that surveys can be conducted over the telephone, which is not a recommended method, but it can be used if needed. And surveys can be administered to individuals, the primary cook, or members of the household, groups. The one of the cons about surveys is that they rely on recall, which can be misleading. With stove use sensors, they are an objective measurement and not reliant at all on recall. They also allow scientifically robust testing of hypotheses. Um, the cons of sensors are that they can be expensive and they can break easily. Um, and sensor handling and data analysis is quite complicated and can require training and specific types of software. Um, if your project chooses to go with the survey option over the sensor option, it's recommended that at a minimum, each household should be visited in person, and a usage survey should be conducted that incorporates a three-dimensional approach to ascertaining stove use, which includes kitchen observation, and that's by the enumerator, an in-person interview with the main cook, and multiple photos of the cooking area, which includes all stoves and the kitchen area and the house itself. This three-dimensional approach was created to limit the impact that reporting and observer bias can have on estimate of stove use when sensors are not possible. Because self-reported compliance is oftentimes exaggerated by the participant, we recommend that a representative subsample of selected households have temperature sensors placed on all stoves or fires for at least 2 to 4 weeks. And the subsample size can be quite variable as long as they are on some subset of stoves and households within the study. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but seasonality is a really important consideration when thinking about stove use. Adaptation should be made to the assessment methods in areas where there are known significant seasonal fluctuations in stove use. Um, Stove use surveys need to be able to capture any major changes in stove use that occur throughout the year. It's very common in many communities around the world where people's cooking behavior varies greatly from the rainy season to the dry season. Seasonal variations can have significant impact on overall emissions reductions. And one way to address this would be to require stove use surveys to be conducted in each of the major seasons in the same randomly selected households every other year. Field team training is very, very, very important and crucial to obtaining a complete, accurate stove use data set, whether you're using sensors or surveys. Uh, A trained professional should conduct a workshop immediately before the fieldwork commences so that it's really fresh in the enumerator's minds. And this training should ensure that all team members have the knowledge and skills to carry out the required work for confidence. And if this is surveys, they should have practice the surveys on each other and in the pilot and really understand what the survey is trying to accomplish. And if it's sensors, they should feel really confident in placing the sensors, launching the sensors, and downloading the data from the sensors. The field team should understand the study objectives and be proficient with data collection, management processes, and troubleshooting when necessary. The trainer should also provide detailed written guidelines and instructions for all procedures, and these should be updated when necessary. There should be close supervision of the field team, including direct observations of the field team members, and this can be done in the pilot households and also during the survey itself. Regular review of the collected data should be carried out, especially in the first days of data collection, to assess the field team members' performance and to give a little more guidance to those that are not quite meeting the standard. So if the trainer cannot be there personally, it's really important that he or she is able to remotely review the data, and this can be done by asking the field team to upload the surveys very regularly. One other important thing to note that in some cultures, it might be imperative to have field team workers as sometimes the participants are not comfortable speaking alone to men, especially if their husbands are not around. I want to again just reinforce the importance of performing a pilot study. So, all data collection tools, whether surveys or sensors, should be piloted in advance of the formal survey to ensure they are effective and efficient. And again, this can seem a little tedious, but it could really save a lot of time and study funding. Um, Also, assessing cooking patterns frequently involves asking very specific questions about practices that are often highly localized. And translated survey tools should be back translated into the original language by an independent translator. And then the two versions, the originally translated document and the back translated document, should be compared to identify questions that may have lost their original meaning. And this can be a little time consuming, but it is very important to have accurate questions to ask the participants. Verification checks are a really important quality um, control aspect of any study. You can do a verification check of the household visit by asking the field team to record the GPS coordinates of each household they visit. And this can be done really easily on their phone or tablet if that's how they're collecting the survey information. Um, the dated and location stamped photos of households also serves as a verification tool, and this can be done on, again, that same phone or tablet, or if they're collecting survey data manually, they can take the photos with a camera, which also has the option for date and location stamped photos. You also want to verify the accuracy of the data, and electronic data collection methods should be encouraged because they allow for real-time data checking, which I talked about on the previous slide. They also can be built to include consistency checks within the database. For example, not allowing the recording of 8 days in response to the question, how many days per week did you use your stove? So, one of the three-dimensional aspects of assessing stove use through a survey is observation. And this slide gives us an example of how a field team member would assess stove use while in a home. They would ask the participant if he or she could show them the kitchen or cooking area, and then they would answer a series of questions, which you can see below, on whether they actually see the new technology and what the status of the new technology is upon their arrival in the home. This slide also shows that the field team should take photographs of the cooking area and the stove and really clearly identify the household ID in those photographs, which is an important reference tool. In addition to observation to determine stove use through a survey, there's also use reported by the participant. And the next two slides are examples of how we determine use by asking the participant a series of questions. And we first would ask him or her how many different stoves or fryers do you use at least one time in a week? And this just gives us a really good idea of all technologies that they're using. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, defining stove use through survey can be quite complex. And on this slide, we just give a few more examples of specific questions that we'd ask to determine use. So one of the most important defining questions we ask is, how many days a week do you usually light your new technology? And then if they fall into the category of what we have determined as use, we move on to ask a few more questions, such as, which would you say is the stove you currently use most of the time? Which fuel do you use on the stove at this time of year? Do you ever use any other fuels? And what type of stove did you use most of the time before you received your new technology. So moving on from surveys and going back to sensors for a moment, um, as I said before, these sensors don't rely on recall and are a much more accurate way of measuring stove usage, but the analysis can be very time consuming and it is much more expensive to purchase the sensors and train a field team to use them and process and analyze the data than it would be to just administer surveys. So on this slide, we see some examples of stove use monitors. First, we have the Maxim I button, which are very small button size temperature loggers that can be taped directly to the stove. Um, if you have a very hot stove, like a 3-stone fire, you can use a silicone insulating pad or wood to protect them from very high heats. They can be really handy, but they are also easy to lose and sometimes attractive to children and uh, have a lower threshold in temperature than this next image of an infrared thermocouple. And these instruments are a little bit more expensive usually than the iButtons, but they have higher temperature thresholds. We also have the K-Sums, which makes use of a thermocouple. We have the Next Leaf Stove Trace, which uses a thermocouple and a cell phone, and we have the Sweet Sense. The placement of stove use sensors can be quite variable as there are many, many different kinds of stoves and the temperature thresholds for the sensors varies as well. But some important things to remember are that we don't want to obstruct or interrupt the cooking in any way, especially if you're using a bulkier device. It's important that it's not getting in the way of the primary cook. We also want to avoid the area where the cooking pot sits, as this can break the sensor. We want to avoid the base of the stove if liquids are likely to collect there, and avoid areas where liquids are likely to boil over. If the stove is moved around frequently, we want to avoid the handle. We want to locate the area of maximum temperature variation during stove use so we can get some really nice peaks. We want to avoid areas where the temperature exceeds the limits of the device, which is stove and sensor type dependent. And you can test the stove temperature during your pilot to get a really good idea of placement on each specific stove. Placement should be as consistent as possible within stove types so that temperature traces across stoves are similar. And you can help the field team understand this during the training. And again, placement pilots are highly recommended for all stove types. For the most effective use of stove use sensors, we recommend ambient temperature measurements to be taken in 1 to 2 homes per study cluster. We recommend using insulators such as a piece of wood or a silicone pad to protect the sensor from exceeding its maximum rated temperature. We recommend using sensor holders and taking at least 1 but up to 3 photographs showing placement of the sensor. So if something happens to that specific sensor, we can go back and see what not to do. And also to explain the purpose of the sensor to the participant, as sometimes these devices can be very attractive to children as little toys. So here's an example of some stove use sensor data, and we can see that placement was really great for both the new stove and the traditional stove, as we're seeing some really distinct peaks that fall back down to a really nice baseline, and it's pretty easy for us to count up events right here. Analyzing sensor data is done in a variety of ways, and it can be quite complex, as we talked about earlier. Suggested outcomes of interest that result from sensor data collection include average number of cooking events per day, total for all stoves, and then per day by stove, average time cooking or duration, per day total for all stoves, and then per day by stove, average cooking time per event by stove, and proportion of total cooking carried out on an intervention stove. Um, there are a lot of new technologies available for sensor analysis, including Summit, which is free and online, Summaries, which is also free and online, and Sum's iButton analysis software, which is provided by Berkeley Air Monitoring Group. This image is an overview schematic that shows the whole ADALY process over time. The example we have here is one stove project with a 5-year crediting period, and it shows all of the monitoring requirements. You can see that the technology was distributed at year 0 by the first large teal arrow, and even before that, as indicated by the first black arrow down, the baseline household survey and the baseline personal exposure monitoring need to be completed. In years 1, 3, and 5, the personal exposure monitoring needs to be completed again, as indicated by the bright green arrows. And project surveys and usage surveys need to be administered every 6 months following stove dissemination for the duration of the sampling. Starting in year 5, the project needs to be renewed, and this whole process will need to be repeated, including the baseline measurements and the baseline survey. So the example of this schedule concludes the Module 2 presentation. Thank you for listening, and please enjoy the rest of the talks.